Hey guys, so um, I was just thinking I should probably close one. Today, remember I said yesterday, like I had things that I had to try and do today. Pull you up here. So I leave the house today, and there immediately says like accident ahead, like road closures, like on my navigation, and I'm like, okay, so it's like rerouting. And you can look this up actually. You see what I'm talking about? You can look up like Lakinta gas leak. So it turns out there was a gas leak. They shut down areas, they evacuated, and the stores I was going to like shut down for the day. And you were like not supposed to be around there. I went into such an attack and I started thinking like I'm been poisoned and like also like that I can't go there. So it's like, what's gonna happen? Like it took me so long to calm down, but like I hardly have a voice right now from, like, all the crying today, and I think tomorrow, like, I'll probably wake up and be, like, even yeah, they said it was a 2-inch gas leak, you can look it up, like, you'll see this is what, happened in my area, it's all in the news. Look at this. Turkey leg, so March Madness, yeah. I'm just thinking I'm probably gonna take tomorrow off because I my voice is already hurting bad now, and I think tomorrow it's gonna be really bad, um, when I can get up and it's like getting an accident, um, and then you have, like, inflammation the next day. Um, like, I think I can already feel it getting worse, but I'll be fine. I'll be back Saturday and then read Sunday, but I'm just like, I'm gonna read tonight, but, what I did today so sorry off the dog. Um, what happened, I tried to order some milk for because I thought I was being poisoned, and it was like, they they I never had an order where they gave someone else the order, like, while I was waiting, and then you couldn't write them again. I started panicking even more, so I'm, like, crying and crying. Um, but eventually, I thought, "Okay, well, I'm stuck at home, I can't do the things I needed to do." That didn't have to be done exactly today, but I wanted to get ahead on it for her, you know? So, I ended up, uh, working on drawers in that room, and then some, like, in the garage. So, I had 27 yesterday, now it's up to 32 in the garage, and I got, like I am up to 40 in that room. I kinda psychologically started at 0. I might have had, like, a couple done, but, um so 40, um, progress. Yeah. Um, oh, that skeleton, I put it in the trash, because, I think I told you that the thrift store didn't take it, but I brought it to go to the thrift, but then I put it outside when I got back, so I thought someone would take it. Maybe they didn't know, like, I was, like, giving it away. So I put it in the trash. Somebody took it out of the trash. I thought that was good, you know, when one woman's trash is I don't know whoever took it's treasure, but hey, that made me happy because I was like they were like, "We don't take Halloween, stuff this time of year." But somebody wanted it, you know? So that's good. So yeah, that was my day. Um, not as bad as it was gonna be from the beginning because I ended up getting accomplishment on the drawers and focusing on that. I mean, that room is still a disaster, it's still a mess, but progress. Um, and, I, feel good about that, but, yeah, my voice is kind of a mess, but anyhow, we start tonight. They never spoke this way again. So you'll recall yesterday, um, the last like I read, she, your hair look like this? She was talking to her dad like, he was being, like, forcibly retired because of the, dementia, um, and he said, like, "You're gonna have to, like, like, understand that I'll probably be dead before your, like, adulthood," and was told her, like was, like, sentimental about it, and that's probably what she meant, like, they never spoke that way again. Um, but I also wanted to say, we're starting today on page 126. And you know what? I don't see any designated, like, section. Wait, hold on. I just saw something. No. Oh, here we go. Like, this says 2009 San Francisco. Okay. I don't know if that's where it starts the next section. Possibly. Yeah. Okay. And then, wait, hold on. What was that? I don't know. Okay. So let's see how many pages we're at. 451. 451. And we are starting today at 126. Just to give you a general idea. Hmm, okay. I didn't know what you meant. Um, the Terry, but okay. um, if I'm walking like an injured person, like that's been working aggressively, I have. Oh, we didn't be forced to retire. Okay, gotcha. Ugh, hey guys. They never spoke this way again. After much consideration, Ada did not give him the speech she had prepared for him, thinking that he would deem it too maudlin. Instead, she kept it for herself, reading it occasionally to remind herself, as her father declined, of how he used to be. The morning after David's retirement was an odd one. It was a Saturday, and there was no reason to leave the house. No lab to go to, even if they had wanted to. David was quite still and sat with a book of poetry near the windows at the front of the house, not really reading. At last, some free time, he said, feigning cheer. I've been meaning to get to this for years. Ada made a lunch for both of them of pickled herring sandwiches. That sounds disgusting. Oh, thank you, Jerry. I wonder if that's like a Boston thing. Uh, on white bread, his favorite, and cut them into dainty, crustless bites and served them with strong tea. Afterward, she begged him to walk to the library with her, simply for something to do, and he agreed. He looked at the librarian, Anna Holmes, without much recognition, even though she had worked there for years and called him by name, and even though Ada had once wondered idly whether the two of them might have crushes on one another. How are you, David? Asked Miss Holmes, clearly happy to see him. It's been so long. David looked at her quizzically. Quite well, he said. Thank you for asking. Later, Ada read and worked on problems until it was time for dinner and bed, where she prayed without much faith or conviction for the healing of her father, thinking of Julian of Norwich, of Franny Glass. Sunday was much the same, and then on Monday it was time to go back to school. Ada admonished her father not to leave the house. Their exterior doors, original to the house, could be locked with an old-fashioned skeleton key from the outside. Ada hesitated, but then decided, feeling guilty, that it would be best and safest for David if she did so that day and every day thereafter. She had not told anyone about David's recent wanderings. She feared they would take him away. After her school day ended, she raced home, hoping desperately that he had neither broken out nor panicked, that she would not find him reduced to tears on the floor or find him in some other equally upsetting position. But he seemed fine, sitting placidly in his chair by the window, gazing out of it. Ah, Hater Nation. Where are you going when you say you're going up north? You are up north for the weekend. Ugh. Hmm. In the ensuing weeks, Ada attempted to extract all the information she could before it faded, but he grew more and more reticent. I simply can't remember, my dear, he said tiredly. So instead, she wrote down memories that he had at one time or another shared with her. To the best of her memory, that her grandfather was the grandson of Finnish immigrants who made their money upon arriving in the United States in shipping, that her grandmother was a descendant of William Bradford, the British separatist, the Mayflower passenger, the governor of Plymouth Colony, that his mother's maiden name was Amory. All of this Ada wrote down in a blue covered notebook, separate from the marbled ones in which David wrote his assignments. Oh, okay. Okay. When she asked him to confirm that he had written, reading what she had written, reading the facts aloud, he told her that he could not recall. Amory, he said to her, I've never heard of it. Ada called this period in David's life working from home to preserve her sense of hope and his sense of dignity. And each day she set out some task for him to complete. And on weekends, she brought home several newspapers and pored over them with him. He became increasingly obsessive about Elixir. Interacting with it seemed to be the only thing that brought him solace anymore. Sometimes, when he had trouble finding the words, he simply pointed to the office, and then she walked him into it and sat him down at his computer. She opened Elixir for him and left the room out of respect and let him type. Now you, he told her, when he had finished, and it occurred to her that perhaps he had the conviction that Elixir was his legacy, she signed him out, signed herself in. Dutifully, she conversed with the machine. Sometimes she still tried to encourage him to focus on his work, but mainly he just sat in front of it, looking at it silently for long stretches of time, a puzzled, painful look on his face. Sometimes she brought out the floppy disk he had given her one August night 2 years prior. At the end of his failed dinner party, for Ada was still marked upon its hard cover. In David's handwriting, a note from him to Ada was still affixed to the disk itself. She inserted it into the disk drive. Then she sat down with David in front of it and asked him to help her solve it. So again, it's a series of letters like DHARS, and like it's like one and a half like bars of text down. Read the text file. It looked completely arbitrary. David was quiet at these times, watching as she wrote down on pieces of paper in front of her the letters that appeared before her on the screen. As she tallied their frequency, made slash marks above them on the page. One day, Ada turned the computer on and it displayed an icon of a frowning, X-eyed monitor and would not boot up at all. David pointed at the computer screen. Just like me, he said, about the sad little Mac on the screen, and Ada laughed in relief that he still could make a joke. She vowed to fix the computer, but she couldn't. Time for Elixir? David asked daily. He had retained the word surprisingly well, and She had to tell him that his Mac was broken and bring him upstairs to use hers instead. While he worked, she tried and tried in his office to fix whatever was preventing his computer from starting. In light of David's illness, the state of the machine took on greater meaning, but she couldn't. She needed David's help, and he could no longer give it. At the time of David's retirement, the lab was working on a system to increase Elixir's vocabulary by training outsiders to chat with it correctly, which David had always been opposed to. Liston, the new director, discussed the lab's progress with Ada in bits and pieces each time she saw her. Prior to the onset of David's disease, she had always seemed hesitant to involve Ada in the work of the lab, not because she doubted her ability to learn it, but because long ago she had unofficially designated herself a counterbalance to David in regard to Ada's well being, and as such, pushed her gently backward into childhood to the best of her ability while he beckoned her forth. Now that David was fading, however, Liston seemed to realize how much Ada missed the work and included her in it whenever she could. She came over for dinner once a week, sometimes bringing Maddie, her youngest. When she could convince him to come along, he read comic books in a corner, looking at all of them suspiciously from time to time, not saying much. Other times, she came alone, and she updated Ada on the work of the lab, the problems they'd encountered, the tangles they were working out, and sometimes tried to help remotely, presenting her findings to Liston the next time she saw her or spoke to her, once calling the lab with a solution that had presented itself to her suddenly in the middle of the previous sleepless night. Thank you so much, honey, said Liston, and Ada heard in her voice that they had fixed it themselves already. At school, Ada was distracted. She had settled into a painful, uncomfortable existence at Queen of Angels. She rarely spoke, except when directly called upon, not wanting to ask David to buy her a backpack, and properly humiliated out of ever using a briefcase again. She settled on simply carrying her books in her arms every place she went, which earned her odd glances and several nicknames that she overheard, despite her best efforts to tune out every conversation around her. She had no friends, nor had any enemies, really. She brought a novel to lunch every day, balanced at the top of the stack of her school books, and read it when she ate, slowly, neatly, making certain with searching hands that she had wiped her mouth clean after every bite. Simultaneously, she felt invisible and too observed, and she fantasized at times about what it would be like to be an amorphous, incorporeal, the manifestation of the vision she had upon leaving the Steiner lab for the final time, a shadow girl who could slip imperceptibly around corners and through hallways, keeping close to the wall. She existed, but was not seen. In the privacy of her room, under cover of night, she sometimes practiced the mannerisms and dialect that she had seen children her own age using. Like, she whispered to herself, totally, whatever. She longed now to be pretty. After weighing the evidence, she had recently decided that she was not, which in her former life would not have mattered. In fact, David had always seemed to consider prettiness a detriment, something hampering and debilitating, like a tin can tied to one's leg. But at Queen of Angels, prettiness was all. Melanie McCarthy was the standard bearer in this realm, and everyone else in the eighth grade could be ranked in descending order after her. Ada was, she felt sure, near the bottom. In the mirror, she took off her glasses, and her reflection became hazier, better, softer, better. She put them back on and frowned. The glasses themselves, she thought, were maybe the problem, but to ask David for contacts would be unthinkable. akin to asking him for something like breast implants. She went to bed sighing long sighs, dreading the morning. As David's mental decline accelerated, Ada clung to his physical presence in the house and dreaded the day when he would not be there. She reverted to an old pattern. When Liston came over for dinner now, she worked her hardest to convince her that he was well, that his mind was sharper than it was, his memory more capable. She coached him on topics of conversation in advance, went over the day's headlines with him, as she used to do herself before the dinner parties he once threw. David was just saying, she would begin, and then dispense an opinion that she herself had constructed after a careful perusal of world events. Right, David? She asked him, and he would look at Ada vaguely and nod. He had always been kind to Mattie, and he continued to be so. When it occurred to him, he gave Mattie some little token each time he came over, a book or a fancy pen or a piece of chocolate. Sometimes the chocolate was too old, and Ada had to swap it out for something else, but mostly Mattie didn't notice. With time, though, David forgot Mattie's name, and then forgot him altogether. Who's this young fellow? He began to ask, and Mattie seemed terrified of him, avoiding his gaze. Finally, refusing to come altogether, Liston didn't tell Ada this, but she knew it to be true. Liston protected her. He's got basketball practice in the evening now, she told Ada. William takes him over. The rest of the members of the lab stopped by from time to time at first, but soon their visits dwindled in frequency, and now, when David forgot their names, it made Ada perversely satisfied. If they came more, she thought, he'd know them better. Still, she prompted him, wanting him to think well of him and of her too. Cheerily, yeah, wanting them to think well of him and her too, cheerily glossing over the extent of his deterioration. When Regina O'Brien came for her monthly visit, she employed the same techniques. At the end of each visit, she took Ada into another room and asked if she felt comfortable living in the home, and she always said yes. For a time, it seemed to be working. Ada felt she could take care of her father. Sometimes, when he fell asleep at his desk or in his chair, a book in his hands, unread, Ada sat across from him and imagined him back to his previous state. Imagined that when he woke, he would spring up vigorously from his chair and beckon her into the dining room and lay out before her some famous proof or problem and set her to work upon it, spinning her like a top. Very good, Ada, he used to tell her when she solved it. Excellent work, smart girl, he would say, benedictions that she craved now beyond all measure. Well done, she whispered to herself at times, when she solved a problem that she'd assigned herself from the notebooks David, in his former incarceration, had created for her. Well done, you clever girl. And she imagined that David was saying it. Oh my God, Terry, I was like, you're trying to be cute. And I got worried for you. I'm like, wait, hold on. What? You spraying yourself? Mm. Okay, first of all, no, I didn't know that, Terry, but I've never had breast implants like yourself. Okay. She got by in this way. She managed. She vowed to keep up the charade of David's competence for as long as she could. And then in May, David walked out of his room without his clothes on, which mortified Ada to the point of incapacitation. Get dressed, she said abruptly, and then she ran and hid in her bedroom. When she emerged, he had thankfully complied, but he did this with some frequency thereafter, until she began to lay out his clothes for the day and night upon his bed, ordering him to get into them when it was time, and closing his bedroom door behind her while he did so. "Are you dressed?" she asked him, and only when he replied affirmatively did Ada enter. Often he grew frustrated as he searched for words. "The thing that's like a wrench, but not a wrench," he said. "The thing that's black and small. The thing that you use. The thing that I love." And then when thing eluded him, "I want it. Where is it?" There were times where she could not help. Next, he began to swear at her. She had steeled herself for this, having read several scholarly articles that indicated that the aphasia associated with Alzheimer's often left one's arsenal of curses located in a different region of the brain unaffected. But the reality of it shocked her. Gentle David, calling her words that he had never before used in her presence. David, who deplored cursing. He knew her less and less, sometimes raising a fist at her as if in anger and then letting it drop to his side, sometimes weeping like a small child, which troubled her soul. "My friend," he said by then about all people, in order to avoid their names, including his own daughter. "Ada," she sometimes said in response, in front of Liston. She pretended it did not bother her, but in private she railed at him from time to time. "You know my name," she said to him testily, and once or twice she had yelled it at him with her full voice. "I'm Ada," she had said. "You named me Ada." She had never before shouted at him, and it felt terrible and thrilling all at once. In those moments he blinked at her. He did not flinch. He seemed aware somehow of the importance of keeping his pride intact, a citadel, as his mental faculties crumbled around it. And as Ada wailed at him, shouting her own name, he would turn his head slowly to some nearby object and gaze upon it. Other times she whispered it to him, her name, imagining somehow that it might seep into his consciousness subliminally, while he was sleeping, while he was awake, and staring blankly out a window onto Shawmut Way. "I'm your daughter, Ada." He did not respond. More and more every week he tried to wander. The bells went off in the middle of the night. She leapt from her bed. She grew weary. One day Ada came home from school to find 3 large fire trucks lined up along Shawmut Way. Liston, in her work clothes, stood outside of David's house, speaking to a firefighter. Their neighbors stood nearby in little groups. Even Miss O'Keefe had gotten up out of her lawn chair for the occasion, was leaning on her cane, straining to overhear what they were saying. It was then that Ada saw David sitting on the ground, a blanket wrapped around him despite the warm weather. A firefighter was sitting next to him casually, attempting to chat with him as he sat there on the grass. He looked childlike and confused, a 5-year-old waiting for his mother. His feet were pointed upward toward the sky. His head hung low, and he was shaking it almost imperceptibly from side to side. In the spring air, Ada picked up the smell of something acrid. Smoke, she realized. Her instinct in that moment was to run. But then Liston turned and saw her and strode toward her quickly. "Ada," she said, "honey, did you lock him inside? Was David locked inside every day?" Ada felt something rising up inside her. It was the unfairness of it all, of being expected to watch over David, who was supposed to be watching over her. She felt simultaneously ashamed and self-righteous. What else was I supposed to do? She wanted to ask Liston. Her father was her responsibility, not anybody else's, and she had made the best decision she could make. But she could not articulate any of this, for her voice had been taken from her. Instead, she stood in place, looking down. her arms folded tightly about her waist, waiting for anyone, to recognize the injustice of it all, until at last Liston put an arm around her and led her down the street. St. Andrew's Manor was in Quincy, just outside the city. It was a nice place overseen by an order of nice nuns. Liston's own mother ended her days there after a debilitating stroke. Shortly after the day that David almost set the house on fire, as it turned out, a neighbor had heard the sound of the smoke detector going off for too long and had called the fire department. Liston had had a serious conversation with Ada, and at last Ada gave her consent. David would no longer live with Ada on Shawmut Way. Liston, as previously agreed, would assume full guardianship of Ada, who at 14 was 4 years from legal adulthood, and David would move into St. Andrews. When Ada first heard the name of the place, she thought it might be something fancy. A country house with a semicircular driveway and a stable, a Tudor mansion set back in the woods. Liston said that all David would need were some clothes, maybe some pictures to put on his shelves, at which point Ada realized that they had no pictures, nothing they kept in frames around the house. Liston's house, on the other hand, was decorated almost exclusively with photographs of her sons and daughters, and her grandson or friends of hers, with Liston at the beach, or family. She even had pictures of Ada in the lab on Halloween at their Christmas parties. Shyly, Ada asked her if she might take one of those to bring along with David so that he would be able to remember her. They had almost no pictures in their home. Zoom it up, couple. Sorry. David's camera shyness meant there were none of him, and he rarely thought to take a picture of Ada. Of course, baby, said Liston. I think that's a really good idea. And she brought Ada over to her house and let her choose any one that she wanted. After some consideration, Ada selected one from a photo album, perhaps 3 years old. In it, Ada was sitting at the monitor in the main room of the lab, chatting with Elixir, smiling happily toward the camera, but looking up above it, for she remembered it was David she'd been looking at, David who had been standing behind Liston as she took the shot, saying something silly about formaggio or fromage. Liston selected a few more and said that she would find frames for them all, and then she put a hand on Ada's shoulder. It'll be okay, kiddo, she said. Ada looked up at her warm face and wanted badly to smile for her, but she found that she couldn't. The morning of David's departure, he seemed more confused than usual. He hardly spoke. Ada and Liston had spent the previous evening packing his clothes into a large suitcase, and beholding it, David put one hand to his cheek plaintively. But where are we going? He said over and over again. We're moving, said Liston. Someplace great, an adventure. No, thank you, he said politely at one point. Just before David walked out the kitchen door for the last time, Ada had the urge suddenly to tell him to look around the house once more, to go down into the basement, to place a hand on his work desk, to go up into the hot and dusty attic, to go and sit on his old bed for a while. Did he know that this would be his last glimpse of the house he had grown to love? But Liston was guiding him out the door already, perhaps to avoid upsetting him. Where are we going now? Asked David one last time. Put your seatbelt on, honey, Liston said to David. He complied, and then let his arms fall limply at his sides. From her place in the basement, Ada gazed at his hands. In the left one, he was clutching his lucky charm, the clover-shaped trinket he usually carried with him. Recently, it had comforted her to see him holding it. At least, she'd been telling herself, he remembered to put that in his pocket each day. But that day, it pained Ada to see it, bespeaking as it did some unfulfilled wish. His hands around it, looking doughy, inflated somehow, too large for his body. They didn't look like the hands of a working man, nothing like David's strong hands as they flew about at one time, dismantling things, reconstructing them, chopping and stirring his meals. Recently, she thought, less than 2 years ago. What sort of place is it? David was saying. And tell me the name again. St. Andrew's Manor, said Ada, hoping that the sound of the name would please him. Manor being a word that she imagined might have some similar connotations for him as it did for her, of dignity, of prestige, of gray impressive stone. But what he said was, oh, of all the things, and she wondered if this was a specific response to the name or simply an arbitrary outburst, evidence of the way his temper had been flaring recently at odd, unpredictable moments. Phrases like that one had become a catch-all for him. Manor sounds like creepy and haunted. Don't you think? Don't you think? Don't you think? I love you. I love you. Go back to snoring then. Phrases like that one became a catch-all for him when he couldn't muster a more appropriate response. For heaven's sake! Good heavens! I'll be damned! It reminded her of the way Elixir had been given a set of responses to use when nothing else was available. David reverted to them frequently by then, and when he uttered them, she read in his eyes a certain disappointment that he could not conjure up a more precise choice of words, volley quickly back the best response, finding the mot just had been a skill on which he had prided himself for as long as Ada could remember. Before the illness, he had loathed puns and loved cleverness in equal measure. Words to David were nearly mathematical. There was a very clearly a correct one for every slot in every sentence. When he was at his sharpest, he rolled them into place like a putter on a green. Now, a good day meant that he could come up with a dozen in a row that were appropriate to the situation at hand. In the front seat, Liston was making small talk. She feigned cheerfulness for David's sake, to keep him settled, but she glanced at Ada in the rearview mirror every few moments, and Ada looked out the window. Liston had told her again and again that this was the best thing for David, that he couldn't be cared for safely at home, not anymore. But since the decision had been made for him to go to St. Andrew's, Ada had been envisioning almost obsessively other lives, other plans for herself and her father. She daydreamed often about running away with him to New York City, to a different country, to the cabin in the woods of the Adirondacks that David had rented for years. Conveniently, these daydreams simultaneously allowed her to envision leaving behind her education at Queen of Angels as well. And when she was not daydreaming, she was paying extra attention to David's mannerisms, his appearance, his gait. She wanted to memorize them. with the little camera she rarely used. She had recently been taking photographs of him surreptitiously in different places in the house. Later, these would look to her like pictures of a ghost. In them, he was expressionless. Gone were David's funny, theoretical, changing features. In their place was the lion face she had read about in articles, a term that frightened her with its implication of cruelty, its implication that the bearer of such a countenance might suddenly eat her alive. Instead, she tried to think of David's face as a doll's face, a still and quiet mask. Liston turned right at a sign that bore the name of the facility in an even font that reminded her of the lettering on banks. St. Andrew's Manor, established in 1951. At the top of a small hill sat several low brick buildings in the shape of a U. Liston pulled her car into the parking lot, and Ada saw the big fingers of David's left hand curl into a fist. She leaned forward to take in the view. Two old women, much older than David, sat in wheelchairs on the paved driveway that abutted the front entrance. They were slumped in their chairs. One seemed asleep, her head lolling forward on her chest. The other moved her feet back and forth slowly, as if trying to get up and walk. The three of them got out of the car. David, only after Liston's prompting. He was relatively able-bodied still, and got up quickly from his seat and closed the door behind him in one easy motion. There was a plaque to the right of the white front door that identified Andrew as the patron saint of fishermen, and once Ada got inside, she saw why the place was named for him. The large rear windows of the lobby looked east to the harbor, some distance away, visible from the building only by virtue of the elevation of its plot of land. Still, Ada could see boats there, sailing inland and out, and it was a sunny day, which made everything seem a little less dismal. The rest of the lobby was drab and beige, with floral patterns on the pillows, with arrangements of armchairs and tables and books she was certain no one ever looked at, and two fireplaces that looked similarly untouched. They might not even work, she thought, and she wished that they did. David's love of fireplaces was well known to everyone who knew him. David stood and looked at the ocean while Liston navigated the front desk. Ada was grateful to her for doing this so that she didn't have to. She had a speech prepared to make to the administration and staff about David's needs and concerns, but it had gone out of her head, and she stood with David and stared. In a moment of self-awareness, she closed her jaw. He seemed too young to be in this place, she thought. Who would he talk to? She vowed to visit him every day, taking 2 buses from Dorchester to Quincy. After a moment, 2 administrators emerged from a hallway, one a Carmelite nun. "How are you, sister?" said Liston cheerily. It was clear from the nun's response that she remembered Liston from her mother's time in residence. She introduced herself. Ada was uncertain about whether to shake her hand. She had not shaken the hands of any of the nuns who taught her upon meeting them. But this one offered hers to Ada kindly, and she took it very gently, ignoring the admonitions David had always given her about being firm and businesslike when she gripped anybody's hand in greeting. She was younger than Ada had thought most nuns to be. She must have been very young indeed the last time Liston had seen her, and she said her name was Sister Catherine. The other administrator was Patrick Rowan, a middle-aged man with stale breath in a wide blue tie. Ada immediately disliked him for the way he took David's hand with one of his and put an arm behind David's back, as if David were incapable of walking, as if he needed anyone else to navigate him in this way. David, too, recoiled. Oh, for heaven's sake, said David. What a production! And Ada felt warm with satisfaction that he had produced such an appropriate response. Their little group walked down the hallway toward a wing called the Mount Carmel Center for Memory Care and stopped outside a set of double doors. Patrick Rowan punched in a code and the doors swung open as Ada walked through them. She turned back over her shoulder and noticed an identical keypad on the opposite side. Clearly, there was no leaving this wing without the password. After several turns that left her feeling disoriented, she came to David's room. On the wall outside, it was a placard with two paper cards slid into it. One that said, Mr. David Sibelius, Doctor. Ada thought to herself, not Mr. And one that said, Mr. John Gaynor. Inside, she saw that David's roommate was ancient. To her, he looked 100 or more. Though later, as an adult, she realized he had probably been closer to 85. He said nothing to them as they entered. He was a small man sitting in a recliner. No, thank you, Jerry. That cradled him like a hammock. His back bowed, his little neat feet sticking up at the end, an enormous magnifying glass in one hand, looking through it at a book that he did not lower as their party of 5 entered the room. Good afternoon, Mr. Gaynor, said Patrick Rowan loudly. And then he turned to Ada and said, in a normal voice, Mr. Gaynor can't hear much. He brought David toward Mr. Gaynor and bent down, placing a hand on his shoulder. This is David Sibelius, said Patrick Rowan, your new roommate. How do you do, said Mr. Gaynor, and David nodded formally. The room was large and decorated sparsely. A brown wooden crucifix, like the ones at Queen of Angels, hung above the door on the inside wall. Ada wondered if it was David's roommate or a standard part of the decor in every room. The 2 twin beds were on opposite walls, and on Mr. Gaynor's bed there was a blue crocheted blanket that somebody, his wife, Ada wondered, had made for him. There were 2 matching recliners that looked quite comfortable, and 2 wooden-backed chairs, 2 dressers, 2 nightstands, 2 bookshelves mounted to the walls above the beds, too small for the collection of books still sitting in Liston's car. Not that David read much anymore, but Ada had imagined that to have his favorites with him would be comforting, like the photographs of her and their friends that Liston had brought along. Disappointingly, the large window opposite the door looked out at the parking lot. She wished he had had a harbor view. The ceiling was made of large panels that looked to her like styrofoam. She had the impression that they could be taken out quite easily from movies she'd seen involving heists. Briefly, her mind wandered once more to absconding with David. The floor was blue vinyl The overheads were painfully fluorescent, a type of light that David despised and found depressing. He had commented on it all his life. Whenever they found themselves in restaurants or stores where they were employed, if only they'd do something about the lights, though, he had lamented, in certain locations in the past. He had even coaxed Tran into using incandescent light bulbs several years ago, offering to pay for them himself. Now he was looking around his new room. He circled it once, slowly. He opened up a small drawer in the nightstand. Into it, he put his lucky clover charm. He crossed the drawer again. He offered up a closed smile. I'll be darned, he said, as Sister Catherine moved about the room, smoothing the tightly made white bed, fluffing the pillows. Now, Ada, she said, I'm going to write down David's direct line for you, all right? This is his phone number, she said. You can reach him any time. And David, you can call Ada any time too. We can help you. She took a small pad of paper out of the breast pocket of her large dark blazer and, after writing on it, ripped off a piece of it and handed it to Ada. David smiled faintly. Our residents are very happy here, she said. Ada believed that. She believed this. Isn't that right, Mr. Gaynor? She asked, raising her voice. But Mr. Gaynor had already gone back to his book, and he did not know he was being addressed. I know Mom was, said Liston politely. Liston sat with David on the edge of his bed while Ada ran back and forth to the car, unloading his possessions with the help of a metal dolly that Patrick Rowan found for her. When she had everything set up, she asked him if he'd like anything moved. Slowly, he looked about the room. He walked to the bedside table and touched one of the photographs that Liston had framed. It was a shot of the group of them, the Steiner lab, leaning forward over a dinner table at a restaurant that Ada could no longer remember the name of. It had been taken perhaps 4 years prior. Ada looked noticeably younger and smaller in it, and Liston's hair was a slightly different shade of red. David, as usual, was missing from the shot. He'd been the photographer. The restaurant, a Thai place they had gone to only once or twice, had since closed. Ada had liked it. They all ate shoeless, sitting on the floor, their feet in a little sunken pit below the table, and her chicken and cashews had come served in half of a hollowed-out pineapple. They probably reused that time after time, Liston had said, horrified, but Ada and David had not cared. This was the picture David lifted now from the table. Amarind, he said suddenly, the name of the restaurant, and Ada wondered if they had made a mistake admitting him here. They stayed with him through lunch, and Liston tried to make friends on his behalf. She charmed the staff, one of whom, a woman named Peggy, had grown up next door to her in Dorchester. Some of the others she knew as well. Oh, she's terrible, she whispered to Ada, upon seeing a tall, thin, spectral woman at the end of a hallway, and she turned them all abruptly in the opposite direction. She waved to the other residents, asking them their names, introduced David to them as they all walked by. Ada did not want to admit to anyone, not even herself, but she was frightened being there. The old people around her frightened her. Some of them were slumped in their wheelchairs, tilted askew. Later in her life, she would seek out the presence of older people, find them comforting, find peace near them. But now she avoided their gaze. It could not be comfortable, she thought, for some of them to be alive. One of them approached her too quickly, called her by the wrong name. There she is, said the old lady. Oh, Patty, I didn't know where you'd gone. Ada walked by her, forcing forward, and said nothing. She realized that David had said such things. was capable of saying such things, but he was familiar to her at least. She had watched this slow progression in him. She could still see some essential Davidness and still, in most ways, take comfort in it. After lunch, they walked him back to the common area adjacent to the dining room, where Mr. Gaynor was seated at a card table, staring at a puzzle that had already been completed. "Why don't we sit here for a while?" said Liston, and she perched on the arm of a floral sofa while Ada and David sat in it and made cheery conversation with the two of them and with everyone else in the room. "This was my mother's favorite place to sit in the evenings before dinner," said Liston, and just for a moment, through Ada's own sadness, she recognized the sadness of Liston, the pain that she must have felt at the loss of her mother. It was something she had never truly considered about adults. She had always somehow imagined that the loss of a loved one would hurt less for them, that it would feel like something natural, that they would be calm and practiced and dulled to death. In fact, she was counting on it, for she had been telling herself that if only David would hold on to life for the next decade, by the time she was 24, she would be better equipped to handle his absence. But something in Liston's voice, as she spoke of her mother, made Ada realize that she had been incorrect in this assumption. 20 to 30 minutes passed by, and then Liston looked at her watch. They had been there for nearly 6 hours, and Ada knew that she would want to get home for Maddie. "It's time for us to go, David," said Ada, so that Liston would not have to. He nodded slowly. They walked him back to his room, and then he sat down stiffly on his bed, his hands on his knees. He looked too thin. He did not look at her. A flash of anger overcame her suddenly at the unfairness of it all. He was not like the rest of them, she thought. He could not possibly belong here, in this place, full of the dying, the near dead. Snap out of it, she wanted to tell him. Wake up. "I'll see you tomorrow," said Ada instead. And as she left him, walking slowly down the hallway, she willed herself not to look back. She thought of the story of Lot's wife and of David's voice as he had told it to her many years ago. In honor of Ada's first evening as a member of the Liston household, the head of it had planned a family dinner. She had commanded her boys to be there and invited her daughter Joni too. "I'll be right back," said Ada when they pulled onto Shawmut Way. And then she returned briefly to David's house to gather together a few more things before moving permanently to Liston's, just as she had done a year ago. "No, thank you again, Jerry." The first time David disappeared, Ada packed some clothes and books into a little suitcase, and then, for a moment, she paused and sat down briefly on her bed. She looked around the hot, close room that had been hers since she could remember. It was an eaves chamber with a half-high closet in which hung the few items of clothing she presently owned, each one of which David had bought for her whenever he had thought of it or whenever he had been reminded to by Liston, and some from the past that she was particularly fond of. The dirndl he had purchased for her in Munich, which she had long since outgrown, a little pair of Dutch wooden shoes hand-painted with tulips, a beautiful silk kimono purchased in Kyoto. She went through all of these now, tenderly, remembering each trip, forcing herself to consider the idea that she would never take a trip with David again. Then she folded the several shirts she had that currently fit her and her one pair of jeans and underwear and socks, and the several training bras that Liston had taken her to buy 2 years ago, stealing her away from the lab for the afternoon. Tell your father if you want to, Liston had said. He won't care. And he wouldn't have, but Ada didn't, telling herself out of embarrassment that it was not necessary. They didn't fit her properly anymore. She would have to work up her courage to either tell Liston or to venture into a department store by herself. All of these items she packed into her little blue suitcase. Its faded leather had reminded her always of the skin of an elephant, an observation that had once made David laugh aloud. Then, at last, Ada walked down the wide wooden staircase that took her to the first floor, bearing her suitcase bravely in her left hand and hanging on to the banister with her right. How many times had she walked down this staircase and in anticipation of some new discovery, some new lesson that would be imparted to her by her father, her creator, some conversation that would open before her a new dimension of the universe, a new chapter of the history of the world. Ada was relieved to find, upon entering Liston's house, that her sons were nowhere to be found. Dinner was planned for 6:30. Everyone's out, said Liston, but they'll be back soon. They'd better be anyway. Then she showed her up to her new room, Maddie's old one, which, in the last week, Liston had stripped of its boyishness and made as plain as she could. Maddie had now been given permanent residency in Gregory's room. Ada shuddered to think how Gregory might have reacted to this change, and the race car bed had been moved with him. A twin bed with a dust ruffle and a pink and orange afghan, Joni's when she was small, said Liston, had replaced it. A small pupil's desk with a lid that opened upward was pushed against a windowed wall, and a pine dresser, emptied, had been positioned near the closet. On the floor was a carpet with a somewhat psychedelic pattern of neon flowers, poppies, she thought, that Liston proudly said she had found at the Salvation Army, her favorite place to shop. Will you be okay in here, honey? Asked Liston, and Ada nodded brightly, although she already missed the quietness, the warmth, the dusty, uncomfortable heat of her old bedroom. In here, the air conditioning that Liston had insisted on was turned up too high for Ada's liking, and she put on a sweater as soon as Liston had left. From the first floor, faint sounds made their way up the stairs. The television, pots and pans, clanking in the kitchen, Liston letting out one loud yell when something went awry. The kitchen door as it opened and closed, a female voice Ada recognized as Joni's, and the babyish exclamations of her son Kenny, and then, finally, a low male voice that made the blood speed up in Ada's veins. She opened her suitcase, considered what to wear. The jeans she decided, would have to do. Although they were unfashionable, too stiff, too large, much darker than the acid wash versions that were in style then. These she paired with a large purple t-shirt, purple she had once furtively read in a woman's magazine in a waiting room, brought out the color of brown eyes, and leather sandals, the same unisex kind that David wore himself. For the first time, she rolled the sleeves of her t-shirt up, a style she had seen other children wear, and then she braided her hair. In the mirror, she took her glasses off and then put them back on. She had wished she had pierced ears. At 6:25, descending the stairs, Ada felt nervous in a way she had never rarely felt in her lifetime. Despite her geographic proximity to them, despite the fact that during her year-long tenure at Queen of Angels, she had regularly glimpsed all three boys in the hallway, and outside, Gregory with his head down, glancing up furtively from beneath lowered eyebrows, William with his head tossed back in laughter or in pride, despite the fact that she had bravely held up her hand to them in greeting each time she had seen any of them. This would be the first real meal she had ever shared with all of the Listons. Liston had set up places at the dining room table as a way that reminded Ada, or in a way that reminded Ada of the dinner parties David used to have. Maddie was seated already, eagerly holding upright his knife and fork on either side of his plate. Gregory was next to him. "Hi," said Maddie, and Gregory said nothing. "Hi," said Ada softly. "Are you here, Ada?" Liston called out from the kitchen. "Oh, good. Come in here for a sec." Timidly, Ada walked around the corner into the kitchen, where the faint smell of something burning was masked by the scent of onions simmering in a pan. The baby was playing on the floor on a blanket. Joni, plump and blonde and smiling, a larger and younger version of Liston, was standing above him, watching her mother cook, and William Liston was leaning against the counter, a can of Coke in his hand. "Hey," he said to Ada as she walked in, and she managed to reply. "You remember Joni, honey, right?" said Liston, who was stirring frantically, barely pausing to turn around. "Dinner's just going to be the tiniest bit late," she said. At the table, Liston lit a candle, the way that David always did. "Fancy," said William, and Liston frowned at him. Ada was sitting on the same side as Maddie and Gregory. Across from her were William and Joni and Kenny. Liston sat at the head. Liston held up a large glass of the artificially sweetened iced tea she drank as part of her ongoing attempt to lose weight, and said, "Honey, we are so happy to have you here. Dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, boiled frozen peas, cooked slightly too long, with 2 pats of butter on the top, boiled frozen carrots, similarly prepared, was passed around the table. Ada was not hungry. Her nervousness made it nearly impossible to finish even a few small bites, and she twirled and twirled the pasta on her plate, moving it this way and that. The boys and Joni talked over one another raucously, except for quiet Gregory, who sat and ate his meal dourly, sitting very still. The baby, Kenny, squawked and patted his spaghetti with an open palm until Joni grabbed his hand and said no, at which point he dissolved into hurt tears. The noise, the volume of it, the disarray of 5 children at a table, Ada included herself in this figure somewhat tentatively, were a shock to her. She fought against her instinct, which was to put both hands over both ears and hide beneath the table. Liston happily presided over everyone. "This is really nice," she said twice. "Don't you think, guys? We should do this more often," she mused. Frequently, though briefly, Ada glanced at William, who slouched in his chair and held his fork with his fist. He looked back at her curiously several times, and once asked her about one of her teachers at Queen of Angels, and she managed a reply light-hearted enough to satisfy herself. Toward the end of the meal, Liston told Ada to wait where she was and went into the other room. She brought back with her something clumsily gift wrapped, an amorphous object concealed behind wrapping paper covered in balloons. A little welcome present, said Liston. When Ada opened it, she saw it was a backpack, a simple blue one, exactly the kind she would have chosen if she had the chance. It was the kind her classmates owned. It was inconspicuous. It was perfect. I've seen you carrying all those books to school in your arms, said Liston. Out the window, you poor thing. Thank you so much, said Ada, with as much sincerity as she could muster. But although she was indeed grateful to have it, this token that indicated in some fundamental way that she belonged among her peers, she also sensed the loss of something. Her father's difference, her own. When the dinner was over, Ada returned to her new bedroom and thought of David in his new bedroom, sharing a room with Mr. Gaynor, who probably would not even speak to him. She wondered about the state of his mind that night, wondered what he realized, what confused him. He had to feel disoriented, she thought, in his new home, with its linoleum floors and its terrible fluorescent lights. Suddenly, she remembered the piece of paper Sister Catherine had handed her with David's direct line on it. She opened her suitcase and fished in it for the shorts she had been wearing earlier, and from them she pulled David's number. There was no telephone in Ada's room, but she put her head out into the hallway and, finding it empty, picked up the extension on a nearby table and dialed. It was 9 o'clock, not too late to call, she hoped. The phone rang 5 times. She began to be worried. And then, at last, someone answered. Hello, said David. He sounded worried. He sounded unlike himself. David, she said, it's me. A pause. Are you okay? She asked. Is everything okay there? She was speaking quietly to avoid being overheard by any of the Listons. Still, he said nothing. David, said Ada, and then, impulsively, she tried a word she had never used before. Dad? I'm sorry, said David. I don't know who this is, he said, and then he hung up the phone. The following week, Liston put David's house on the market, where it would stay, she told Ada, for months, perhaps years. It was the 1980s, and houses in Dorchester were slow to sell, even in Savin Hill. The buzzing controversy of the previous decade had quieted, but it had brought to the surface such unspeakable ugliness and hatred that the city felt somehow altered in its wake. Boston's molecules had reorganized themselves in a way that felt noticeable and wrong. Many of its citizens, mainly working class and middle class Bostonians of Irish and Italian descent, had left for the towns to the west and north and south, and good riddance, David had said. Savin Hill, which felt suburban, even rural in parts, had been largely unaltered, but its residents had become even more firmly tribal, even more convinced that the rest of Dorchester was a place to be avoided. The Globe and the Herald were filled with stories about the violence transpiring in other parts of the city. And when Ada and David used to take long walks in the evening into different neighborhoods, they had once heard gunshots in the distance. Connie Reardon, Liston's friend in real estate, seemed pessimistic about the home's odds of selling quickly. Secretly, Ada was glad. Liston said that the two of them had to go through the house together, begin to sort out David's possessions. But she was tired every day after work, and every weekend she said nothing at all about it. Her new position as head of the lab meant that she sometimes went in on weekends, The rest of her free time she wanted to spend with her boys. Ada said nothing either. She was happy to leave everything just as it was, a museum about her life with David. Her after school visits to David at St. Andrews replaced her after school visits to David at the lab. When school ended for the summer, Ada went back to a semblance of her former life, spending every day with David. Some mornings, she even returned to the lab with Liston. Other days, she would spend all day at St. Andrews. She became well known to Sister Catherine and Patrick Rowan and to all the others. The high school girls who sat sentry at the front desk, one of whom she recognized from Queen of Angels, though neither of them ever acknowledged this fact. The nurses who cared for all of the residents. The changes in David came quickly at times and slowly at others. Her research had prepared her. There would be good days and bad. She attempted sometimes to explain the literature she'd studied to David, hoping that to discuss the disease scientifically would bring a measure of comfort to him, would make him feel less disoriented, but by that time he was typically unable to follow long stories or monologues, and halfway through he often interrupted with something pleasant but unrelated, an aside about a nearby bouquet or the sunny weather. Other times their visits were marred by his bad temper, which came on more and more frequently. No, he said, over and over again, outside of any context, with an adamacy that made her feel as if she had done something incorrect. He wagged his head slowly back and forth, adopting the demeanor of someone who had been badly wronged. And then other visits were nice, hazy, pleasant reminders of what had been. David lodging funny complaints, sometimes too loudly, about one or another resident as the two of them strolled down a hallway. A terrible thief, he would say, or that cantankerous terrible fool, or good-naturedly praising the staff. She's my favorite, he'd say, within earshot of a nurse, and then the same about another nurse at the end of another hallway. Or complimenting the desk attendants on their attire, simply to have something kind to say. When he was in these moods, Ada told him about the lab and what Liston was working on, and Hayato and Frank, if Liston, when she visited, repeated the same information, it didn't matter. David nodded along in the same abstracted way. Liston's new role as lab director had brought with it a new set of responsibilities and concerns. She was now in charge of procuring a large percentage of the funds for their research through federal grants. Her presence was newly required at a number of institutional meetings each month with administrators at the bit to advocate for the needs of the lab. She oversaw the interviewing and placement of grad students and the coordination of everyone's schedule. I tell you, Ada, said Liston, after several months of filling this role, I have a whole new respect for your father. But her new and busier schedule also meant that she was home later in the evening, left earlier each day. From living with David, Ada was used to helping with the management of a household, and so she did what she could to take on some of Liston's responsibilities. She also made it her responsibility to keep David's disease at bay as much as she possibly could. Each summer day she'd spend inside the air-conditioned buildings of St. Andrews. She treated as an opportunity to keep David's mind engaged. She came armed with new exercises for him to complete, new experiments in brain stimulation that she had carefully culled from the literature. She tried crossword puzzles with him, mnemonic devices. She had him memorize lists of words and attempt to repeat them back to her 5 minutes later. Dutifully, sadly, he participated, but she soon found that each session left him slump-shouldered and low, and so reluctantly she stopped. On good days, he asked after the other lab members. When he could not remember their names, he asked after simply the gang, and he always asked after Elixir. I hope you're not ruining Elixir, he said often, or I hope you're keeping the program in shape. Have you chatted with Elixir today? He asked her, the way a different parent might ask a child if she'd said her prayers. Toward the end of the summer, David entered a period of very sharp decline. Perhaps it was the monotony of living at St. Andrews. Perhaps it was the lack of interaction with his former colleagues. Whatever it was, he went from speaking in full sentences and following conversations fairly well to spending his days in a state of semi-permanent puzzlement. Within a span of 3 months, she was losing him too quickly, and she didn't understand why or how. She discussed this with Liston, who had also noticed the change, and the two of them brought David to see his specialist, who conducted a brain scan to look for signs of a stroke or vascular dementia. Some other reason for this acceleration, but nothing was found. David became quieter, more easily tired. He was moved to a new room and placed with a new roommate. Ada found that she was sad to say goodbye to neat little proper Mr. Gaynor. He seemed like a good match for David after all. David's new view, at least, was better. Now he had a distant view of the lawn and then the harbor, but his new roommate, whom she only knew as Paul, ranted almost unceasingly, and Ada often took David to sit in a chair in the hallway just to quiet the sound. She held his hand instead of talking, the first time she had done so since she was very small. One day she arrived to find that his accent had changed. His vowels had taken on an odd Midwestern quality. He stressed certain syllables emphatically in an unnatural sounding way. Wash, he said, instead of wash. It unnerved her. His voice was the last thing about him that felt familiar to her. And now even that was different, as if someone else's voice were emanating from David's person. Why are you talking like that? She asked him. But it was one of his bad days. And he didn't respond. She shook his head instead, beginning his mantra of no, looking down at the floor, but even his no sounded Midwestern, a countryish nah, 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 a clipped glottal sound concluding each declaration. Toward the end of Ada's visit, she found Sister Catherine and brought her to David's room. David, say hello to Sister Catherine, she told him. But the fog had descended completely by then, and he just wagged his head at the floor, in stupefaction. What would you like for dinner? Ada asked him. Sister Catherine walked to him and put a gentle hand on his shoulder. David, she said. But his bowed head was the head of a man in prayer. And both of them suddenly felt rude for interrupting. Who is that? Said David, finally, quietly. Later that week, Ada went to the Bits Research Library and searched all the literature she'd read for anything on changes in accent, but there was nothing to be found. In the fall, Ada began her freshman year at the Queen of Angels Upper School, housed in the same building as the lower school, but fittingly located on the top 3 floors. Certain things had changed. She had a friend now, a girl named Lisa Grady, who was nearly as quiet as she was and who came from a similar family. She too was an only child, and her parents were two older academics who taught at Tufts and BU. She too wore glasses. At first, Ada was embarrassed by their similarity, self-conscious of how interchangeable the two of them must appear to the other students at Queen of Angels. Two meek, mousy newcomers in a sea of friends who had known each other for years. But soon she learned to relish Lisa's quiet company. The two of them spent every lunch period reading for pleasure, side by side, at one of the smaller tables on the periphery of the cafeteria. After school, she continued to visit David and then to furtively re-enter her old home, which was becoming more and more decrepit in the absence of any residents. Still, she treasured it. She retreated to her old room, the only place left where she felt truly like herself. And then she read and read. She chatted with Elixir. Sometimes she napped, only to wake after an hour with the conviction, always, that David would be downstairs. At work, puttering, planning, that it would be nearly time for her to venture downstairs for a lesson. She clung to these quiet moments, this liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, lingering in her confusion, willing herself backward into her dreams. In the new house, she was still quiet in front of anyone but Liston. Joni, who dropped by frequently with Kenny, was pleasant to Ada, but clearly befuddled by her existence. She often raised her eyebrows at things that Ada said or shook her head in amazement or bemusement. Ada could not tell. On weekends, she stayed in her room most of the time, except to go to church with Liston and Maddie on Sundays. Liston, though scientific and methodical, was a devout Catholic. There was a little picture of the Pope in her office at the lab. To Ada, this was fascinating. And when she was younger, she often asked Liston about it, and Liston hesitantly responded, afraid perhaps of David overhearing. Her two older boys had recently been complaining so bitterly about going that Liston had given up. But Matty, an occasional altar boy, loved going, spending time with his mother, seeing his friends. They all three sat together in the warm wooden pew of the Queen of Angels church next door to the school, infused with a hazy golden light from the stained glass windows depicting the stations of the cross. In her pew, Ada listened attentively, but with a certain amount of confusion as the Mass was said. At Ada's request, Liston taught her how to genuflect before sitting, how to pray the rosary, how to go before Father Frank and receive a blessing. First, she was not a baptized Catholic and never or since she was and had never made her first Holy Communion. Every Sunday, Father Kevin put his large warm hand on Ada's head and closed his eyes for a moment. And peering up at him, she wondered what he was thinking, what he said in his mind when he prayed for her. David was an atheist, but he said he did not begrudge others their religion. And it makes sense for Liston. He had always said, Ada, therefore, told herself she had his tacit approval, though she never told him she had been going. For Mattie, who had warmed to her, Ada made lunch in the morning and cooked dinner each night. At first, Liston protested, but it pleased Ada to be useful in some way, and she assured her that she had done far more for David. Ada's name did not appear on the chore chart Liston kept for her sons, so she overcompensated, wanting to be certain not to foster resentment in the boys. In the evenings, she helped Mattie with his homework, trying to be patient, which required a vastly different approach than the one David had always taken with her. Mattie was bright but unfocused, and his mind often wandered mid mid-sentence, leaping from a discussion of long division to one of tree frogs or of He-Man, a cartoon he loved and watched daily, surreptitiously, because his brother William said he was too old, or of whether there was a God. When William was home, Mattie tracked his every movement, not turning his head, taking in his mannerisms and idioms. Sometimes mouthing a particular phrase to himself after William had uttered it. Though their motives were different, his somehow more excusable in Ada's mind, a natural way for a younger sibling to behave. She related to Mattie on this point and frowned to herself when William casually teased him about one thing or another. She knew what it was like to covet another person's easiness and effortlessness. The difference, she supposed, was that Mattie would one day achieve both, whereas she knew with certainty that she never would. If Mattie was preoccupied with William's demeanor, Ada was preoccupied still with his looks. He was a senior at the upper school to which she now belonged, and therefore she passed him in the hallway with some frequency, darting her eyes toward him bravely and waving each time she did. He was a source of endless fascination to her. Every day she discovered some new angle of his frame or face. The way he looked when he stood by the light of a nearby window, the way he looked in dusk approaching the house, the way he looked when he was tired and yawning and stretching out his lengthy arms, the graceful way he mimed the shooting of a basketball or the swinging of a bat or a golf club, though she didn't suppose he had ever golfed. The self-conscious way he scratched at his left shoulder with his right hand, or swiped at the bridge of his nose, or pushed back the warm light hair from his brow. In October, he had a birthday. Liston brought home a cake from a nearby bakery, and all of them stood around while she coerced him to make a wish. I wish you'd let me go hang out with my friends, said William. And Liston said that wishes made aloud were never granted, and he was 17 now. 17 was an age that resounded in Ada's head as something iconic, an age about which poems were written and songs were sung. She was 14, and she would not turn 15 until March. No one wrote poetry about 14-year-olds. Gregory was the most difficult of the brothers to understand. A year younger than Ada, he was dark and quiet, perhaps even quieter than she was. When he did speak, he stammered, not so profoundly that any intervention was deemed necessary, but noticeably enough. He seemed unhappy most of the time. At school, he was always alone. He was ignored by both his brothers. Maddie's heart belonged to William, and William's, when he was not otherwise occupied with friends or girls, divided his time between teasing Maddie and imparting to him valuable lessons about boyhood and manhood. There was a sense, she could tell, of obligation in William to be a father to Maddie since their own father had left. But Gregory somehow existed outside of this dynamic, too old for babying, too different from William to be mentored the way he mentored Maddie. Ada had seen several people hollering at Gregory in the hallways at school, and she often overheard their classmates refer to him as a loser, seemingly the worst insult anyone could be given at Queen of Angels. Once she had seen a commotion in the hallway ahead of her, the backs of perhaps a dozen seventh graders forming a tight little circle around a jostling mass in the center. She skirted the hubbub quickly, not wanting to be part of it, but as she passed, she had caught a quick glimpse between shoulders of Gregory's face contorted in pain as a huge, angry eighth grader collared him around the neck. Briefly, he had returned her gaze and then, recognizing her, quickly looked away. And then he was gone entirely, pulled down to the ground by his persecutor. And just as quickly, a teacher had emerged from a nearby classroom and broken everything up. Sometimes Liston still turned to her for advice on Gregory, on all her sons, really, as she had always done, but Ada never told her what she had seen. Now that she was a member of her household, lodged right in the middle of Liston's children, age-wise, Ada suddenly wished to be treated as such. Her talks with Liston became a burden to her, a reminder that despite her best efforts, she would never truly fit in among her peers. Does Gregory seem unhappy? Liston asked her. He's gotten so quiet. I'm not really sure, Ada began to say politely in response to Liston's questions, or I wish I knew. Or sometimes he seems okay to me. She did not want to be a traitor now, an informant, but Liston seemed hurt by her withdrawal, and she began to ask Ada pointedly if she was all right. About Gregory, Liston's concern was that he was antisocial. To a certain extent, he was. He spent most of his time on the top floor of the house, a sort of attic, doing God knows what in Liston's parlance. He only emerged to forage for food in the kitchen. When she crossed paths with him there or at school, he said nothing at all to her, except to tip his head backwards in what might have been a nod. She often wondered what he did all afternoon and evening. One late afternoon after her return from St. Andrews, and on a rare occasion when nobody was home, Ada decided impulsively that she wanted to see Gregory's lair for herself. She opened the door on the upstairs hallway that led to the attic stairs and took them quickly, two at a time. The central air did not extend to the third floor, and she instantly noticed the change in temperature, which felt more familiar to her, more like the home she had shared with David. It smelled familiar to her, too, dusty and mildewed and bookish. All right, I think we'll end it there. He-Man. Okay, yeah, elixir, but it doesn't have the second I, and that's how it's spelled, and it's spelled in all capitals. Yeah. So we're on page 61. Or I'm sorry, 161. um, mm, oh my God. I really hope this book gets like, I don't know if I should say happier, because I mean, ultimately, they're really giving you such a harrowing look inside the, not just somebody with dementia, but to love someone with it, like to like, and you're supposed to and enter the world of a novel, enter Ada's world, and Ada's world right now is so sad. Um, and I'm worried for her when he ultimately passes away. I'm glad for her she has this Liston that she already knew and had like a trust with, and she tried to like look out for her, but I also feel like it may not be like happy and joyous, that he passed away, but maybe some greater message to impart, like in a positive way. Because what I had noticed in the reviews, like that it was like out of 5 stars, it was like 4 point something highlight in a lot of reviews. So but people saying like it's been weeks since I read this book and I keep coming back to it in my mind has really stuck with me. Um, then it's a great book. So I'm like thinking, all right, like it's like you go through like really hard, but maybe we'll get somewhere ultimately we can feel okay with. So right now, ending it for the night, I'm at a place of feeling really like sad. Like I don't want David to be suffering or to die. Um, but there's so much more to go in this story. And I'm excited for that. Like, what is she gonna do in San Francisco in 2009? Yeah. Anyway, um, um, my voice is gonna be so gone tomorrow. But I'll tell you what, I'll order some games. So next Friday, we'll have a lot of fun. And we'll have fun this week and I'll be on Saturday. But I'm just giving you the heads up, like I can't. My voice. So Arthur, put some songs in the chamber for a week from now. But I love you so much. I'm gonna watch The Pit, have something to eat, play with my mutt, have great calves walking all those hills. Okay. Bella, say goodnight. Bella. She's like, you talking to me? Come here. They want to see you. They love you. They love you. Come here. She's like, all right, hi guys. Hey guys. Where's the guy that sings? Mm, love you.